So I am here today with Rochelle and Joseph in person on Warawarang lands. And so I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend those respects to the lands and the ancestors in which you are all gathering from today. This session is a little bit about safety as a felt sense. So it's a little bit about what we're going to run through today. So there's no surprises. I'll try and keep an eye on the chat. So if you do have questions, I may address them as we go, or can come back to them at the end of the session. Um, I guess what am I? I was about to introduce myself. I'm like, no, Rochelle's just done that, and I think we're okay there. So maybe we start with a bit of a grounding. So we've had some amazing, amazing sessions this morning. I feel very fortunate to be learning from the people that have shared. And it can be a lot, and we're covering a lot of different topics, and some of them might be activating for some of us. And so I guess just noticing as we go what we're sensing in our bodies. So you might want to keep your eyes open, maybe you want to close your eyes down. Late morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Maybe bringing awareness to the heart space. Maybe a sigh might feel good. Sometimes doing a longer exhale can be helpful in some people's bodies to help bring the sympathetic nervous system down and help activate the parasympathetic nervous system. And so it can be a nice place to start. And there is a bit of method to my madness there, in that we often spend a lot of time intellectualizing the feeling of safety. We talk about it and we put it in lots of checklists, but it's actually how we feel. Safety is not something we understand intellectually. It's something that's in our bodies. It's a felt sense. So thinking about how we might go through grounding can feel a little bit of woo-woo. But if we're thinking about how safety works in our bodies, grounding or intentionally coming down, perhaps, or noticing what's in our bodies can be a really helpful way to activate that parasympathetic nervous system. And there are some amazing benefits to our brains in doing that. If you are ever wanting a bit of a shortcut way, hands and feet are the way to do it. So noticing what you feel, maybe swaying from one side to the other and noticing pressure changing in the feet. And what we're doing is we're really firing up our brain with receiving all of those signals. And it often can leave a little bit less space for the other stuff, for the worrying about the future or maybe getting caught in the past. So, this idea of grounding and presence can be a really good place to start. We can sometimes get really caught up on determining safety for other people, right? But of course, as it's an internally accessed experience, our physiology, our life experience all come into play. So if I feel safe at work or I feel safe in this room, it's not just about me feeling safe there. It's about all of the interactions that my nervous system has had and what it's predicting, and then what it's sensing when I'm there. PTSD and CPTSD, so complex post traumatic stress disorder, and chronic stress can all really influence our internal access to this. I work with people kind of playing with this space as a trauma informed yoga facilitator. And so some of what I'm sharing with you is based on that. And some of it's a little bit more on organizational leadership practice. So while some of the things we talk about might be a little bit unfamiliar, depending on your exposure, I can absolutely attest to the relevance and the impact of thinking about these things slightly differently. And so, some of you might have heard of the term psychological safety. It was actually coined by a researcher, Amy Edmondson, and it's the idea of how safe do you feel at work? A good example of it might be if you get a room of people together at work, can the most junior, most green person give an idea without consequence, without shaming, without any negative feeling, in front of the most senior person. Like, how psychologically safe is it for real ideas to be exchanged? So, this is a really helpful test, especially in the workplace, because it gives us an idea about how honest people are being and how much they're able to contribute. There's actually laws around it in Australia. And the way that we talk about the laws in Australia is we've got psychosocial safety laws. If you're in Victoria, these are being beefed up as of 1st of November as well, which means that in Australia, employers have an obligation to proactively address psychosocial safety risk. So, psychosocial safety is really just what are the systems and the constructs we have around people so we can encourage psychological safety. So it's really just what are we responsible for as an organisation? What am I responsible for as a manager? And in Australia, we have to proactively address those. We have to think about things like we have to identify and manage psychosocial risk. So that might be like unfair treatment or unclear roles. We have to consult with workers. And we also have to address to prevent harm before it happens. That's like quite a big onus on employers around the idea of creating psychosocial safety. But my problem with this as a yoga facilitator is that I cannot find anywhere in any health and safety legislation or guidance in Australia or elsewhere a connection to the felt sense of safety. So it's all well and good for us to say, oh, this building is safe, these systems are safe for this group of people, but you can't determine that on a checklist because people access safety individually. So, in trauma informed yoga and trauma informed practice, safety is a really, really foundational concept. It's a foundational concept, and it's almost like the first stage that we try and help people get to. And of course, we can't make someone feel safe. We just have to give the cues and do our practices in a way that might encourage them being able to access that, right? But it's so important when we're talking about trauma informed yoga because people that have experienced trauma, people that are experiencing chronic stress or mental health challenges, often a significant impact of that is their ability to access safety. And we need to be able to access a felt sense of safety to be able to focus on interoception, interoception being intra, so our internal perceptions. So my feelings, how it feels on my skin when I do this, what the dog smells like when he drops one when he passes by. So like all of my internal sensations, if I want to focus on those and develop those, I need to be able to access a felt sense of safety. And the reason that we do that in trauma informed yoga is because we are practicing interoception, because then we are helping people practice making choices based on what their bodies are telling them. When people have experienced trauma and big events, quite often these connections in our brains and bodies might be damaged or work a little bit differently. So we really try and focus on safety. We really try and provide an opportunity for people to build interoception, and then we try and help them make choices based off those things. And that is because then taking action based off those choices, if you read trauma recovery literature, is a big part of how we reintegrate, or some people might use the word heal after big events. Now, I emphasize this so much because in trauma informed yoga, we really get into like, how do you create safety? How do you create the conditions to support someone else accessing a felt sense of safety? And I can tell you what, there are no lists on any walls about what the rules are. There is no, like, it's not about the meeting, it's not about the policy, it's not about what someone can recite about safety, because literally none of that matters for someone to access an internal sense of safety. We can't standardize it because it's deeply individual. You're asking me, why am I talking about trauma informed yoga and treating people who have experienced trauma and chronic stress? Mate, have you seen the workplace? Have you seen the world right now? Um, So, the workplace often has a low level of trust. I don't know how many of you are Redditors, but it depends how much time you spend on LinkedIn lunatics or anti-work subreddits as to what kind of stories you hear about people that have experienced big things at work. We also take heaps of experiences into it, right? So I'm not just my experiences that I have in the workplace. I bring all of my experiences and learnings that I had before that point into that place. So for like 20 average Australians, two of them will be diagnosed with PTSD or complex PTSD. That is going to be a lot lower than the actual rates of those conditions, as few people will get diagnoses for them. 3 out of those 20 will have experienced childhood abuse, and so may be more likely to carry trauma with them, perhaps complex trauma with them. 4 of those 20 will have had a diagnosed mental health condition in the last 12 months. Not to mention all of the people that did not get their mental health condition diagnosed, especially the vast amounts of men that don't seek help for mental health conditions. So you can see there's a little bit of story I'm explaining here, which is of those like 20 average Australians, a lot of them are carrying things into the workplace with them that are going to really change how they show up. And UKG study and similar results by a whole lot of human resources and workplace studies are showing that a lot, up to 50% of people are reporting chronic stress in the workplace. Chronic stress mimics a lot of the same impacts that trauma has on our body and brain connection. So we are actually talking about the majority of people in the workplace actually may be some of the people that I'm talking about in terms of impact of trauma, chronic stress, and big things in their lives. So is words on a wall going to make these people feel safe? No, obviously not. That was rhetorical. So, trauma and chronic stress do change how our bodies and brains work together. So we have a few things happen in our brain and body that can be impacted by them. So one is the amygdala, so the reptilian part of our brain, right in the middle. It gets a bit trigger happy and it starts to go off and fire. It starts to alert us of dangers that maybe aren't quite there. And it's really annoying, right? Because our prefrontal cortex is slower at working than our amygdala anyway. But what trauma can do and what chronic stress can do is further damage the link there or make that not work as well, which means that our thinking brain isn't as able to think our way out of that stress. So if we are back here in our reptilian brain, we are not able to think something through, we're not able to learn consequences. So we have, and people are more likely to go into the threat response, right? If we've got the amygdala firing. We've got the prefrontal cortex is maybe less likely to be online at that time too. So it's harder to get out of it. The third thing that happens in the brain, so sorry, those first two, true for trauma and chronic stress, so that it's a similar impact. If people have experienced trauma, they will have also maybe had some changes in the memory centers in the brain as well. And because the way that we record big experiences does change a little bit. And then on top of that, we feel the reactions in our bodies, right? So our brains and bodies start to trigger familiar patterns. And we also recognize these, like, even when we think of these patterns, or our brain is seeking out information and looking for repeated patterns, and it's going, hey, that reminds me of that thing that I know was dangerous. And so I'm going to get triggered here and we're going to start that cycle. So it's not something that's like in people's heads. We're talking about very real changes to the brains and body. And there has been research on people who have had big stressful experiences, and some of them have created lesions in the brain like a stroke. So we're talking about physical changes that are happening to people. And those physical changes changing the way that they are interacting with themselves and with the people around them. Has anyone seen this bad boy before? It's a window of tolerance. So it's another way to, I guess, view what does safety look like. So along the y-axis, oh, I'm proud of myself for remembering that. Activation, so energy going up as it gets further up and down towards the bottom. In the middle, the ventral vagal zone, that's our green zone. That's our parasympathetic nervous system state. When we are in there, we are flexible and we're able to learn and we're able to connect with people and we're able to be creative. That's maybe the core of where we are, who we are. But sometimes activation can happen. So that might be our brain, the amygdala firing. Maybe it's a familiar scent, maybe it's something else. And our energy goes up and it can push us into a sympathetic nervous system state or hyperarousal. So that's where energy goes up. We might get anxious. We have blood pumping. Everything's turning on. We're getting ready to run from the tiger or fight the tiger. Evolutionary. It's an important thing for us to be able to do, right? In a healthy nervous system, we'll be able to come back into our ventral vagal zone. And then maybe something else will happen and we might go into hypoarousal. So we might have our energy come down. So like a depression, low energy. If we've got a healthy nervous system, we might experience that and then we might be able to bring ourselves back up into their ventral vagal zone. There's not one way that this graph looks for people, like it's going to look different for everybody, right? Some people are like alternating between the ventral vagal and the hyperarousal and they're like way up here. Other people, they'll live their life down here. Some people with trauma, some people experiencing chronic stress might spend more time in these zones and they might find it harder to get back into that central zone. It's really important when we're talking about the idea of safety though, right? Because if you can't access internal safety, if you can't get out of your flight response, out of your fight response and access that safety, all of the words on the wall in the world will not matter. You will never believe that you should make that report to HR because work is trustworthy if you're constantly in the zone. You won't necessarily be able to collaborate with someone you're meant to be collaborating with because you're filled with threat response. And so when people operate outside of their window of tolerance, we might see like some behaviours that you might recognise. These are taken, so polyvagal theory, if you're interested in this, if you're wanting to do a Google, Stephen Porges is the guy that penned it. It's a really, really helpful way to explain our nervous system. So that's where those hyperarousal, ventral vagal, these labels have come from as polyvagal theory. So when we have our energy go up, we'll all tend to have one or two kind of stress responses that we tend to default to. We have our stress go up. Lots of people will go into a fight response. We go into a fight response if our body has learned that it's been helpful in the past. That's it. So maybe when we were a kid, it was really helpful to be able to go, no, sibling, you can't punch me. I'm going to, and I punched them back and it worked. And I've learned over time that a fight response is really helpful. I might slip into that a little bit more easily than the others. So it physically, like in yoga, it's like muscular tension. Like it's like people are tense. Like maybe someone's physically got like a tense jaw and angry, like a forehead. It's literally tension in the body because the body is going, I'm getting ready to fight. Blood is going to our arms and legs, heart's going faster. We're also diverting energy away from other places that it might be able to go because you don't need to be digesting when you're worried about fighting a tiger. So our body is really, really flipping what it's concentrating on. Similarly, people might go into a flight response. Have you ever had a micromanager that was all over everything all the time and all over every single detail? Flight response, like most of the time. So a flight response is we see the tiger, we have learned that it is safer for our bodies to run. So that might be like physically running, like moving cities or changing jobs or something. It also might be moving quickly, like moving on to the next thing, not stopping, because if we stop, we might need to look at what's making us anxious. So both of those two responses are really common, both with chronic stress and people that have experienced trauma. At the lower end, when we're talking about energy going down, these ones might be a little bit more common with people who have experienced trauma. So one is a freeze response, and it's like the idea of the deer who's running from the tiger, who doesn't quite get away. So they tried flight, didn't work. The tiger caught up, and what their body and brain does is turns everything off and plays dead. Evolutionary, because tiger probably doesn't want to eat an already dead deer. So it's a survival response, right? To shut down, and then the tiger might wander off and then the deer can leave. It also might be thinking about like depression, freezing, shut down in our bodies. It might be like lethargic, like literally like eyes closing. We are slowing down. The last response, I've got it in hypoarousal. It probably could actually come in at either end. A fawn response, and it's not as often talked about, but it's incredibly common when people have experienced trauma, which is the way to run from the tiger is to appease the tiger. Because if you can give the tiger what it wants before it hurts you, then that's a good evolutionary response, I guess. But like all of these 4Fs, if we default to one, we tend to sometimes default to it too much, maybe sometimes not realizing how much we're defaulting to it. And if we think before to that previous slide, we can sometimes, if we've experienced trauma or chronic stress, sometimes when we get into these zones, it's actually harder to get back into that ventral vagal zone, and that ventral vagal gap, it gets smaller over time. The more time we spend out of it, the harder it is to get in there. So for someone that's experienced trauma, they might mostly be up in fight, flight, and every so often that gets too much and they go straight down into freeze. And then maybe they really briefly enter a ventral vagal, but then something else happens and they flip into a stress response again. So these are really helpful to understand though, because they're true individually, but they're also true in groups and organizations. Just an organism. We tend to attune to the people around us. We tend to attune to the nervous systems around us. So I guess it's helpful to understand these, not because we want to excuse the harmful behaviour that might sometimes come from them when people are tripped into their stress responses. This isn't about no consequences for everybody. However, when we understand this window and we start to think about, well, are there things that we do or that I do or that this thing does that might unintentionally push people into those stress responses? Because that's counter to my aims, right? If I run a team, it might sometimes be easier, or like it might be tempting to do things that might flip people into those responses. But if I'm thinking about my objectives, how we get the work done, team cohesion, I probably want to, as much as reasonable, not to be unreasonable, but I probably want to try and support people to stay or to have access to that ventral vagal zone more. If I'm thinking about their felt sense of safety, if I'm thinking about their psychological safety, I will probably consider that in what I do. So, what does this have to do with leadership? Well, there's two approaches to it all, right? There's always two ways that we can go. We can do the traditional leadership approach, and we can do all the things that health and safety tell us to do and that HR tell us to do and that we hear Simon Sinek tell us to do. And that's so helpful to be reading and learning and doing all of those things. However, if we don't actually do those things and live those things, it doesn't matter. Because what a felt sense of safety tells us, what we can consider from this thinking is that if it doesn't feel real to the team, if it doesn't feel real to the people around you, if it feels performative, they're not on board. It doesn't work. And almost if it's performative, it's worse than not doing it at all. because people that have experienced trauma, people that don't feel safe, as soon as they clock you're a bit of a liar, they are so much less likely to ever take anything you say to be truth again. And for organizations, there's a really big consequence to this, right? Because if you have leaders that are losing that trust and creating that gap in safety, it's your aims that are not like your organization doesn't work. So let me give you a couple of examples. See where this is going. Our beautiful houses, are they the same at the back? I've got one leader that I work with, um, curious, reflective, strengths-based. When people brought him problems, he would ask questions. He would never jump to solutions. Gave honest feedback, so wasn't like nice, but created space for people. And probably was the best example of someone who could actually cultivate psychosocial safety in their team that I've ever seen. The outcome over 5, 10 years was the people that leader led, their careers are stellar. They have all gone into doing big things, like not necessarily like hierarchical, but big, that too, but big mission-led things. They have stepped into being really amazing leaders because they were given the space to actually learn about it. Um, Leader two, similar dialogue, almost identical dialogue. Same stuff about values, about mission, about leadership, but actions didn't follow through. And this is an interesting one because if you spoke to either of their bosses, they would have described their employee exactly the same. Amazing exec, great speaker, really values based, like very much being seen to do all the right things. But leader two told people what they wanted to hear. They made reactive decisions sometimes and then didn't always communicate them amongst the team. So this created an environment where trust amongst their team was impossible because they were all told different things by their leader. As a result of this, interpersonal issues were poorly managed and people started jostling for promotion because whoever was spoken to last seemed to have the best chance of whatever the new opportunity was that came up. Um, Difference of the safety, of the psychological safety for both groups of employees, though, markedly different. And I think it's probably best surmised by this. Leader one, if they called, I think, literally any of the people that ever worked for them and said, I've got like an average paying job, it's not impressive, but it's working for me, I would say the vast majority of those people would say yes, with no additional context, because it wouldn't matter, because that leader created safety, created opportunity. The second leader did that. I don't know of anyone who would say yes. But still on paper, brilliant. And you know what careers are like, right? People might move on after 2, 4 years, and those things don't necessarily follow them. But the people that see it are the ones that are in the house, their team. Their team will cotton on to, can I trust this person? Or external people being told something different than we are being told. So psychosocial safety is not a nice to have, right? It's like a foundational condition of teams. It's a legal requirement in Australia. But, and I love that Mel and Prina actually mentioned this in their session, Google, with all of the money in the world, really wanted to figure out what made their best teams successful. And they did a massive project called Project Aristotle. You can Google it if you like. There is some awesome data there. And what they found was it didn't matter how great an individual contributor was, the best determiner for team performance was psychological safety. So it matters for values, right? I can talk about that till cows come home. It absolutely matters for values, but it also matters for performance. So tell me why it would be okay for us to address safety like a few checklists on the wall. It's why elite sports teams spend so much time on this. It's not just because they care, although I'm sure they say that too. It's because they care about winning. So it matters for the vibe. It matters for your enjoyment of your workplace. It matters for like how much you feel like you're contributing, but it also matters for your performance. So the way that I have learned around this, and I think this is absolutely the best way to address psychosocial safety in the workplace, is by looking at the evidence. And where does that best is trauma-informed practice. So you can find trauma-informed practice in psychology and social work. You can find it in yoga. You can find it in a wild range of things. And trauma-informed practice is really taking this knowledge, taking our understanding about trauma and chronic stress, and looking at what does the evidence say works. And what the evidence says works are these 6 principles. I've spoken to a couple of them, and obviously you can see a few of them line up, right? Trust is there. Why is trust there? Because we have to have trust. We have to build trust to be able to get safety. We need to consider the cultural and historical and gender influences that has led to someone being in front of us, because we have to consider those things when it comes to trauma-informed practice, so we don't redo the same trauma to somebody seeking our help, mental health and disability. Shared experience, so it's about power share. If you go somewhere that you feel a real difference in how much power someone else has over you, obviously that does not build trust. Obviously that does not build safety. Obviously that does not help you access your internal felt sense of safety to be able to participate as best suits. Choice is really important, and choice is important in yoga and in the workplace for a couple of really key reasons. One is it's a really helpful way to help people re-engage their prefrontal cortex by asking, like not asking someone a million questions, but asking a question. Maybe it's even an A-B question. It might not even be high stakes. When someone might be dissociating or maybe is kind of at the bubble of moving into some of those responses, re-engaging the prefrontal cortex can be really beneficial. So we give choice for that reason, but we also give choice for an incredibly important reason, which is if we have experienced trauma, nearly always that is been through a lack of choice, and our ability to access choice psychologically can be damaged. And if we think about how important choice and decision making is in our lives, it can have massive consequences, right? So practicing choice and giving people space to be able to consider what choice might feel like for them is really critical. It's just me going quickly looking at my notes, making sure I didn't miss anything. So if we go back to that window of tolerance and we think about whether I'm a yoga teacher, whether I'm a manager, maybe I've got a project and I've got a group of random people coming together. If I care about the outcome of whatever it is I'm doing, and if I care about the relationship with the person I am doing it with, then I will want to consider, how do I potentially decrease triggers, reasonable things that I can do? How can I decrease things that might stop someone entering this area, right? What are the things that I know? So, for example, we heard earlier about an interview. Such great practice. Telling people questions ahead of the interview, it's not going to make any difference to your interview effectiveness, just FYI if we look at the data, but it will give people who are really concerned, who are worried about like a surprise, who need certainty, it will give them one less reason to get out of their ventral vagal zone, probably where you want them. We can also think about things that, if we're thinking about trauma-informed practices, we think about maybe decreasing things that might push people out of the window, but we can also think about increasing things that might be beneficial to them. So, for example, maybe it is increasing an opportunity of choice. It might not be massive, but for people who have not had choice, a small choice can feel significant. In trauma-informed yoga, we do a lot of work around interoception. So that really deliberately feeling what we feel in our bodies. Um, the reason that we do that is because our ability to do this can really, really help with our ability to ground and with our ability to be in the present moment. So there has been research that's shown that trauma-informed yoga decreases or like helps treat PTSD and CPTSD so effectively and as effectively as the gold standards of treatment, because the interoceptive awareness has been interrupted. And it's a safe, yeah, hopefully a safe way for people to be able to take hold of that for themselves again. So it's massively beneficial. This photo is from the Prison Yoga Project. They have found a 64% recidivism decreases to 6% recidivism when people complete 4 trauma-informed yoga classes when they're in prison. It's insane. Like, it's so effective. If you want to have a feel-good thing, do Google the Prison Yoga Project. They do awesome, awesome work. The other thing that we really emphasize is choice. Um, and we do it through invitational language. So this is linking back to how do we give people the best access to that prefrontal cortex. So we think about things like we say things like, if you would like to, or you might notice. So rather than pushing someone outside of their window of tolerance saying, you will feel this, and then they don't, we're giving people an opportunity to explore. The evidence shows that small linguistic shifts like that really, really influence people's ability to participate, far more so than anyone ever believes will be true when they start the practice, because it sounds so simple, right? I love this. So I don't think being trauma informed in terms of leadership is optional, but I certainly think that we need to think about how we approach safety in a really fundamentally different way if we remotely care about the actual impact to psychosocial safety for people that we are supporting, people that we are working with, people that we are working for. Um, I recently got to interview Dr. Peter Levine, who is the founder of somatic experiencing, which is a really amazingly evidence-based physical practice, which is similar to trauma-informed yoga, I guess, in that we are working with people's physical self and their brain-body connection as an evidence-based practice to help heal or integrate things that they've experienced. And so he's an amazing, amazing man. He's written many books, highly recommend him as an author. And I asked him about, well, what can organizations actually do? Like, where do they best place the effort if they want to become more trauma informed or if they want to shift that felt sense of safety? And he was so clear about it. And I think this is really worth reflecting on. He said that it only will work if the leaders become embodied and if they practice being trauma informed. So it will only work if the leaders all commit to it. Because if you think about who influences the most people in any organization, it's their direct line manager. Thought that this was a really interesting place to land because the Victorian legislation, which starts on the 1st of November around psychosocial safety, actually calls out that your main intervention cannot be training. Now, I don't necessarily disagree with that because I think a lot of the time people just throw training at things and then don't do anything else. But I found that really, really interesting because I would differ. What the evidence tells me is that to create a felt sense of safety, it is really incredibly dependent on the individuals that will guide people through that, which are line managers. Um, so I guess do with that what you will. Um, I see I've got a couple of questions in the chat, and I think that might be about me. So if there's any more to come through, you're welcome to post them. Um, so I've got one here from Ely. Can you touch on workplace burnout and what genuine recovery might look like? in my experience, the impact of burnout has often been underestimated, with an expectation from leadership of an employee to return to the same environment, operating at the same pace. Yeah. I think this is probably where I have a challenge with how we deal with workplace health and safety in Australia. One of the benefits of living here is that we have so much legislation and so much policy and direction. Um, but in actual practice, sometimes we take a really logistic point by point approach and maybe risk re traumatizing or re injuring people by not dealing with the fundamental issue. I think genuine recovery is going to look different for everybody, and I will lean a little bit on some language that I think is helpful. I think for me, recovery or integration, like the idea of, sorry, recovery or healing can sound like really like you need to be able to do it and then it's finished. But the truth is, even with a physical injury, if you break your leg and it heals, you still have an injury, like you still have the record of that, right? Like you might not have the injury or the sickness anymore, but you still have it with you. And I think we quite often don't treat mental health in the same way, because if I am going to, if that's fine, if my leg's healed and I'm back at work and I sit at a desk, I'm not going to re-injure my leg. But if I'm going back into exact same environment, the exact same things that were happening and putting too much stress on my leg or my burnout, I might exacerbate the injury. Um, I think a lot of the time it's a gap in leadership understanding and organizational practice rather than actually like the spirit of the law. Um, so yeah, I don't know if I've actually answered that, but I have given some thoughts. Thank you, Rochelle, for answering that too.
Absolutely. I know we've got a few minutes before our next planned break, but I did have a question I wanted to ask, if that's okay, around yoga and all of everything you've been talking about. An amazing session. But I know that yoga is often recommended for people, and you've talked about how amazing the effects can be. But some people can be resistant to a practice like yoga, or perhaps they've been along and experienced yoga and have hated it, or just not really engaged with it very well. So it just hasn't worked for them. So I'm curious about, why do you think that is, and how do you think those people can get benefits elsewhere?
Great question. Thank you, Rochelle. So the first thing is, a lot of the things I've spoken about are true for trauma-informed yoga, but there are lots of other practices that will do that. So you can do like trauma-informed Tai Chi, you can do trauma-informed boxing, you can do art, you can do surfing, you can do cha-cha. So thinking about healing or integrative activities where we are connecting the body and mind, and we're doing it in a supportive environment, because that's really the key. It's about the support. It's about not being shamed or unnecessarily being triggered into a stress response, so we can learn to be able to spend more time in that middle zone and like what it feels for us. So there are lots of different practices that we could do there. I sometimes do training in psychology practices, and one of the things that I often talk about in them is they'll say, "Who's recommended a client to go to yoga?" And everyone will put their hand up, and like, "Who's had that same client come back to you and said they hated it?" And nearly all of them will do that, and that is because like yoga is a big, big, big beast. And if we think about that window of tolerance, a lot of what we try and practice is finding the right practice or the right tool to help you with what you need with your nervous system. So if someone is like way up in a flight response and anxious all the time and cannot remember the last time that they've taken a breath or been able to like access that ventral vagal zone, if we recommended that person go to a really slow, gentle yoga class, that might feel really, really overwhelming for their nervous system, because it's not necessarily a safe place for them, right? Similarly, you might go to a yin yoga class, which is really amazing for the parasympathetic nervous system, but lots of people really don't like it, because you can be sometimes encouraged in a yin class to stay still for a long period of time. in lots of people's bodies and people that have had trauma, maybe people that have different neurodivergence, that might really, really not sit well. And then you come away from that being like, I hate all yoga. It sucks. Um, it's not for me. When actually there may have been a practice that might be more accessible for them. So if people are curious about trauma-informed yoga, looking up a trauma-informed class and just noticing the difference that you sense yourself when you're hearing a bit more invitational language, and you're able to, whether it's in a trauma-informed yoga class or not, you can actually lean into that graphic I had around interoception and like safety, interoception, choices and action. Anyone can apply that kind of thinking or that framework to an activity that we're doing to also be able to receive some of those nice brain benefits.